Welcome, everyone. And Lynn, thank you for joining us this evening, this morning.
Thank you, Maurice. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we are coming together, first of all, because we'd like to talk about and discuss the general alignments of the planets. And it's interesting that these days they're all grouped,
Yeah.
in one part of the zodiac, which makes them many visible,
Mm,
in our time of year. And
yeah.
also to speak about the event that we are organizing in October, Omega Institute. It's
Mm,
our yearly conference.
mm.
And so this year, the theme is going to be flavored by the transit of Jupiter in Cancer. Of course, so much else is going on. There are so many ingresses in the course of the year. So we come together, first of all, to share a little bit more about what this event is about and why we do what we do, why we bother. It would be so much easier to not have to organize and worry and put things together, but it's part of the service to community, and it's part of a vision to keep astrology's flame burning and inspiring and warming.
Well, yeah, because there is something about being with other people. Like I'm going to Florida in a couple of days for a conference there on March 7th, 8th, 9th. And it's really to gather. It's to gather and to share. And even though we can do that on Zoom, the disembodied quality, being at Omega in that beautiful environment, in the cabins, walking through nature, eating the locally sourced organic food, having I remember last time we went down by the lake, and we gathered outside, and you built that in more this time. And that's really wonderful to have that exchange, to be in a big space. And so it's not just information, it's also the experience, the direct experience and embodied experience and the emotional connection. And I really appreciate that you're doing that, Maurice.
So we spoke about, the astrological climate of the year. We know many changes are ongoing around the world. And
Mm,
it's interesting, we were sharing some ideas about dignities
yeah.
and how, Saturn's going to be in Aries and it's considered fall. And then Jupiter is going to be in Cancer, which is considered exalted.
Mhm.
And Mars just got out of a retrograde in Cancer, which is considered fall as well.
Yeah, that's right. And Venus was in Pisces, which was Venus's exaltation, and Mercury's in Pisces, which is its fall.
And Venus is
Or
in Aries, which is,
yeah, in fall. Yeah. So it's this back and forth, like where is it at its best? And that there's become a lot more attention on these positions. And I always think, well, is it good or bad? Good for what? Bad for
yeah.
what? Yeah. And I love Venus in Aries. I think Venus in Aries is like a woman who steps out of bounds in a way, out of her traditional role, into who's not demure and veiled and hidden behind a particular way of being, is actually taking a daring energy. And so in modern times, I don't think there's been a problem with Venus in Aries, but in a traditional society, you can see that Venus in Aries could be problematic if the feminine is said to stay within certain boundaries. So I think we always have to put these meanings into context. What's
Mhm.
the context in which we're working in? Right?
Yeah. And But I also think that part of the initial thought was that Venus is pacifying, unifying relationship, and when it's in Aries, it's more contentious, regardless of the genders.
Yes.
But we can use the same kind of thought that you were bringing with Mars in water signs, specifically Cancer
Mm.
and Pisces, where it's a considered weak Mars when, you know, we go back to your thought is this association with the male energy in an emotional sign, is that a necessarily something that's not constructive, something that's not productive?
I again, I love the whole idea of Mars in Cancer as protector, defender, not Mars's energy is turned back towards something and protecting or defending or in some ways acting on the past. Now, we all can imagine negative expressions of that. We can imagine um, that everyone is feeling that people might feel unsafe with Mars
Mhm.
and Cancer. So the whole idea of am I safe is what will my world still be secure? Do I need, Mars went into Cancer on the 3rd of January, I think, and the
Fires.
a few days, yes, there were the fires. And so we had immediately this sense of people where their home was in danger. They couldn't protect themselves. But of course, that's not everybody on the planet, but we seem to have these archetypal situations acting out. Or we also had Santorini, where there's been something like 20,000 um, secousses, 20,000
Mhm.
earthquake shocks from 1 to 5.1 in 6 weeks. So this sort of sense that nothing is solid or nothing is safe. So what do we do? And then other people have felt this. Um, you could also interpret Mars in Cancer as going back and dismantling the past.
Mhm.
Like in other ways, um, going and have the courage to change the past. Uh, I think we also have to talk about Mars Out of Bounds,
Mm.
which continues till April 7th. And my friend and colleague Tony Howard, who's done a lot of research into out of bounds planets, Mars went out of bounds January 1st. What that means, if people don't know that, it's gone beyond the latitude, the highest north or low or furthest south latitude of the sun. Mars is in declination, has gone further. And so what that means is there is something that isn't bounded by the usual system. And we certainly all feel that. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't feel that things have gone further than they might. So I don't know if is that weak. Um, I think what's really important is the way we interpret a planet that is in detriment.
Mhm.
In the book, I wrote a quarter of a book on Mars, the Mars Quartet, which is out of print, so you can't really get it. But one of the things I looked at is, how does Mars in each sign enter into battle?
Because of that defense, maybe part of the defense is also how do I fortify emotionally?
Yes.
Because we can see how people can be overreactive or triggered with Mars in Cancer, taking things very personally.
Yeah.
But if we speak about protecting the home, it can also be providing the necessary nourishment, making sure the supplies are there in some ways.
Yeah. I
So
think,
go
yeah,
ahead.
I think well, and it can be necessary nourishment on all levels, on spiritual levels, on a level of really looking at what is the value you would stand up for, right? You know,
Absolutely. And it's very, you know, unfiltered. It's very authentic in
yeah.
that raw form.
And yet it doesn't always act out initially. You know, we always say that cancer moves away from things before it moves forward. And if you watch the movement of the crab, they don't go, they scuttle sideways, backwards, and then they come out. And so there's a kind of a tentative motion. And so a lot of people are saying, nobody's doing anything. And
Mm.
in a way, Mars and Cancer may not be the right time to do those things.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's, you know, it's going direct now. We'll
That's
see,
not correct. Yeah.
we'll see what happens also as the sun moves into Aries, ruled by the Mars.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating that we have two planets. You know, you said it's going direct, but in fact, Mars is at the same degree. And we have two planets sitting on the same degree for that are normally fast moving planets, but they're just sitting in the same place. You know, and you could write a story about that.
So you're mentioning Venus now,
Yeah.
Venus
Venus,
in Aries.
yeah, Venus will be on the same degree for, you know, at least the next week. It's at 10 degrees already. And it's just, it's not moving. So there's this place holding, let's
Mhm.
say. So we can say that people are saying, well, this is it, and there's no negotiation, you know, like one of the things I heard in the news yesterday, no amendments will be accepted. It's this or nothing, you know, but we know that's not going to be true because that might be true for the next 5 days to a week, but then things will start moving again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as we move into the following months, and you know, you mentioned that these categorizations of detriment, you know, domicile, exaltation, detriment, and fall,
Mm.
um, that they must be applied to context of culture and time. So, do you think that these terms are a bit misleading because they do tend to, you know, to kind of give the good and the bad spin without much negotiation, talking about negotiation.
Yeah, what I've noticed is that when I was learning astrology, everybody ignored these things basically. And where they came in, you know, everybody said, oh, it's old-fashioned language. We're not going to pay attention to that, right? But I think where everything came back in my experience, was during the horary revival. Because if you're doing horary astrology, the planets of the moment tell you about the condition of the question,
Sure.
let's say. And there, I think it's really necessary to look at the relative strength of planets. But to put it into to put too much emphasis on it, it's almost like we're seeing things through a slanted point of view, like Jupiter's in Gemini, right? This year it has been in Gemini since last. And the number of negative things I've heard about Jupiter in Gemini, you know, like it's like it's too much. I
Yeah.
think it biases us too much. And so that we may really need to think, you know, I remember years ago, I knew an astrologer who said, well, I have Jupiter Sun in the eighth house, and I've inherited some money, but it's only 1 million, which isn't much because
Yeah.
it's Jupiter in Gemini. It's in detriment. Like, I mean, right. like this, and this was a long time ago. This was maybe 20 years ago. So it's a point of view, but I wouldn't have seen it in that way. Okay.
Yeah. No, again, context. And
Yeah,
Donald Trump, Gemini, would certainly approve of Jupiter in Gemini.
well, it was helpful.
Yeah.
We could say it was very helpful. And but what we can see is that Jupiter in Gemini, which, you know, encourages the trickster energy, the playful thing. You know, I mean, I think we've seen some pretty shocking things in the last week or so, you know, chainsaws and certain kinds of salutes and things, but they're being done tongue in cheek, so we don't know if they're tongue in cheek or serious. You know,
Mhm.
a friend of mine was telling me that is an old movie called Idiocracy where the president has a chainsaw.
Mm.
And, you know, so clearly there's a kind of subculture, again, a contextual way of saying, don't take us seriously. These people taking us seriously have no, you know, like they're just, they don't get it. You know, there's like a double messaging going on. So I could see that as Jupiter in Gemini.
Yeah, but that's, you know, in a way, it's Jupiter in Gemini without any additional label. It's doing what it's meant to do.
That's right. That's what it does.
Yeah.
It does double entendre. It does a double level of meaning and a double level of speaking. And you are asked to find the truth in between what's
Mhm.
being said. But to assume, to take something really literally ends up like if one side says something that's a little bit tongue in cheek and the other side takes it really seriously, it ends up creating a sort of imbalance, you could say. All right, that doesn't really quite work.
That's a great perspective on that.
Yeah. So, so I think, you know, that where Jupiter, you know, again in traditional astrology was godly. It was connected to the divine. So if you think of Jupiter in Gemini, it's connected to the trickster, which is also a form of the divine energy, but a form that is kind of, you know, taking the Mickey out of everybody else, right? So there's inflation, deflation, right, happening in terms of people's sense of what they know or what they're sure about,
Mhm.
and all of that. So, you know, what's said isn't necessarily the truth with Jupiter and Gemini, and that's okay for Jupiter and Gemini. It's not a problem. In other words, uh, that's just another way of, uh,
Yeah, I have an example, however, that is very interesting as far as the Jupiter dignities in particular. An example that I'm going to share the charts, you know, as we speak. This fellow in Japan who was born with Jupiter in Sagittarius, and he was accused in 1966 of a crime of a murder of his boss. And 1966, Jupiter was in Cancer in its exaltation.
mm,
And so he was the last person seen, you know, to have met
mm.
that person, that boss, and he ended up convicted of the crime. And now, 2024, which is almost 60 years, 58 years later, when Jupiter realigned with the natal Jupiter in exact opposition, he was exonerated, saying that basically, you know, there's proof now that he was not the one to commit the crime.
Wow.
And so Jupiter is the law as well, but it's also, you know, the information and the truth. And so we see somehow that, you know, born with a Jupiter in its own sign, convicted erroneously with a Jupiter exalted, and then exonerated with the Jupiter in detriment is kind of a reverse scenario. But I would say it plays a role in the fact that maybe a Jupiter in Sagittarius gives too much confidence to those in power. And, you know, the fact that he was exonerated in a Jupiter in Gemini maybe that brings the element of the inconvenient truth for them. You know, they
I
have to.
Well, it pokes the hole in people's belief systems, let's say, in our belief in what's true and what isn't true. And so, there's a lot of, I think everybody is a bit, off their off their game with Jupiter and Gemini. I mean, that's the point. It's the point of it is is to have you hopping on one foot then the other. It's destabilizing, and it's kind of, um, it's kind of like somebody firing blank bullets and you're dancing on your feet. And this is a little bit what the energy has been like since the
Mm,
beginning of the year. So I do think Jupiter and Gemini is reminding us that we need a sense of humor right now, even though it might
mm.
not feel that way, right? And what you
Yeah.
said, yeah, what you said about not being so sure we're right, I think is pretty important with Jupiter and
Mm,
Gemini.
yeah.
So,
Great conclusions.
yeah, I mean, we can play with this. We're used to interpreting planets and signs, and like what's fascinating about it is that we keep finding new ways to talk about this. All right, so I think one, if people are too set on Venus is at its best in Pisces. I mean, my clients with Venus and Pisces have the most extreme lives. Like, I was talking to one the other day, and I said, you're like a heroine. You're like this character in an opera, who ends up dying dramatically on stage from the lost thing, etc. And she laughed and said, absolutely. She recognized that without drama and excess and extreme, that her Venus in Pisces had to go all the way to all the emotions and all the feelings she could have.
Hmm. And it's interesting that, when Venus was recently on its exaltation degree,
And will be.
when returns there, yeah, we had this fundraising for our colleague,
Yeah.
which is a very unifying gesture, and Venus both represent the financial help and the rallying of people together. But that same day or week is when the whole dismantling of U.S. aid
Yeah.
occurred, which is a humanitarian organization that is supposed to, support the underprivileged everywhere. And so it created this vacuum, very sudden, and, some people see it as justified. Some people see it as, um, some kind of vendetta, or it's being too harsh. But whatever the case, it happened to be on that Venus exaltation degree
Mm,
where a humanitarian organization is collapsing,
mm,
um, which is ironic. What we're talking about here is basically both the sign of exaltation and
mm.
also the degree of exaltation. So not only is a planet considered exalted in a sign, there's a degree where it's climaxing. And for Venus, it's exalted in the sign of Pisces, but then the 27th degree of Pisces is
Right.
supposed to be, the
D-
um,
Do we know where these exaltation degrees come from?
all of it is mysterious and lost in time. So there is no real. There are some theories, there's a really interesting theory that some astrologer advanced, that this was the creation of the world chart. And
Right.
so, it's not very scientific. But yeah, there are some correlations and connection with the fact that, the Sun is exalted in Aries and Saturn in Libra, so they're opposite. And then Jupiter in
Wow.
Cancer and Mars in Capricorn. So all the cardinal signs are kind of reinforced by these strong leadership type planets of Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars.
Sure.
Whereas the traditionally considered benefic planets of Venus, Moon, and Jupiter are all in each other's sign.
Right, and they rule the night part of the chart
Yeah.
too, the whole nocturnal, moist, less glary, less active, less, so the day and night energies, you could say.
So these are theories, but there's nothing really, set in stone about it.
I tend to think that there's maybe the exaltation also has to do with what is the capacity of the planet, and that maybe a planet can go too far when it's exalted. Right, as you were saying, be too confident, be too right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so speaking, let's kind of explore Jupiter in Cancer,
Right.
as it is the theme of our conference.
Mm,
And part of what we're going to discuss is the feminine archetypes.
yeah.
And the idea also that Jupiter represents wisdom, among other things, and higher knowledge. And in Cancer, it can represent the wisdom of, you know, the female archetypes of astrology and the great grandmothers and the ancestral lineage.
Right.
And so I wonder you know, what was your experience with Jupiter in Cancer? How do you feel it may unfold?
Well, I think it is. I think one of the things about Jupiter in Cancer is we have seen Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter was in Cancer in World War II, and it didn't necessarily only bring good things, right? It was. We think of it as again, if you think of it only as wonderful, that doesn't really work in that you can't apply it to everything that's happening. So one of the questions is, what is Jupiter in Cancer good for? Again, how does it work? And I think there's Jupiter is always about wholeness. It's always about growth. Um, and in Cancer, it's the possibility to grow something that will lead to um, what the sign offers. So the possibility to grow um, a kind of caring, or as you said, nurturing energy, as we talked about with Mars and Cancer, is there's this possibility for fecundity, right?
Mm.
For fertility. And it isn't, as you say, I think it isn't always immediately obvious. But what's so powerful about Jupiter in Cancer, there's a moment, the moment it goes into Cancer, there are moments this year where it's the only planet in water. Except the node, except the North Node, which we can't really count. And then in the fall, there's a series of groundwater trines that will be happening in the sky. So although we're shifting into air and fire, we're going to step into this watery energy that we're going to be reminded of a whole other part of our consciousness, right? As Neptune goes back into Pisces and Saturn goes back into Pisces, and they trine the Scorpio planets in the sky, especially during Scorpio time. We'll have these grand trines. So there's an idea of a lot more flow in terms of feeling. Even recently, people have been saying we need more empathy and more
Mhm.
kindness. And I think this is Jupiter in Cancer.
Mm. It's interesting that, we know that all the planets are going to move into air and fire sign, and Jupiter is going to move into water for this year, but then joins the club as it in 2026 moves into Leo as well. And
Mm.
we're going to have a whole period of time where Jupiter and Mars are in Leo together because Mars is going to retrograde in Leo. So there's going to be a lot of this extroverted energy, but the interesting thing is that, the ingresses begin this March
Yeah,
with Neptune into Aries, then Saturn into Aries, and then Uranus
Gemini,
in
yeah.
Gemini, and Pluto's already in Aquarius. So, this kind of movement is accentuated in the following month. And yet we already see this explosion of testosterone.
We do, we do. Well, because I think that's how it works. This is what I was talking about in the classes I was teaching for CMED, is that the new archetypal energy presents itself actually
Right.
beforehand.
Yeah.
It feels like it's already, everybody's talking about.
Yeah.
In France, they have a great word for it. They call it virilism.
Mm.
Virilism, like hyper virility.
Yeah.
And this emphasis on this call up to, but I think, in many ways, this is what the zodiac tells us, is that we move from a letting go in Pisces to this principle of action, initiation, daring, courage. And we can see certain manifestations of it that might not feel particularly comfortable to everyone, or that might feel there's this great attraction, let's say, to a particular kind of energy, but it's not yet consecrated, is the word I want to say.
Yeah.
Word that came to me. It's not yet really gelled, right?
Well, what I find interesting, speaking about what's going on in the United States, even the salutes are very male. Like it's kind of energy going out.
Mm.
There's some phallic association with it, and the expansionism that Trump um, spoke about, Greenland and Panama and the
Yeah,
Gulf of America and Gaza, it's all out. Let's grow out. Let's dare.
yeah,
And it's still words, like you say, it's still in theoretical, the realm of theory, but will it be activated, and integrated when they actually move into these firesides?
yes. I think we will see action, that desire to make things happen, the desire to take control and to create a new narrative. I mean, we've all seen for years that we were entering into a new era. It's clear.
Yeah.
With all the outer planet sign changes. We just didn't know what form it would take, and there were a lot of hopeful theories about it. But things will come, the new will come, and new leaders will arise. So right now we may not know who those new leaders are. And I think, I'm sure you've noticed, like me, that there were people that we've really idealized in the past decades. Uh, People like Nelson Mandela, or people like the Dalai Lama, or uh, some people like the current Pope, some don't. He's, what he represents. His health is fragile right now, and again, it's like it's time for a new generation of leaders to arise, uh, and to in other words, grab the flame, grab the
Mhm.
torch, and carry it forward. And that's on all sides. It's not
Absolutely.
yeah, and so I think that will be quite exciting when that happens. So, we can't really see what's going to happen next year only in terms of what's happening today.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all context, but I think Saturn moving into Aries and then with Neptune on top of it is,
Mm,
it's a seeding time for
mm,
new leadership. And I think, it's interesting that Libra Aries
mm.
represent this constant
Mm.
move forward and then rebalancing, move forward and rebalancing. And it's interesting that during the first Trump administration, when there was so much controversy about, his attitude towards women and comments about women that were you know jarring for many people, and yet his victory um was so surprising, but also very powerful. Like, he made all the changes he wanted to make. But that's also when you had the counter movement of Me Too and the counter movement of the Black Lives Matter after George Floyd killing. And so it seems like wherever we go, in the course of history, there's one movement forward, and there's always going to be a movement to rebalance it. And I see that also with Biden and the vaccines, of how he set a narrative about how things should be politically, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the Ukraine, whether it's
Yeah,
the health department, and how the counter movement is showing. So there's always that.
right. There is a counter movement, but there is a new vision coming in that will shape and color. Well, as we know, the next 35 years or so, it's not just, I mean, certainly the next 20 years, but the combination of Saturn Neptune is part of that. Like, it's not just planets changing sign, it's also all these cycles being activated and coming
Mm,
together almost simultaneously. Well, this year, as you know, you've done a huge amount of research and writing and wonderful reflection on the Saturn Neptune conjunction. And so it isn't, it's a whole bunch of stuff,
yeah,
really.
yeah,
Uh, so going into Jupiter in Cancer is kind of like going back into taking everything that's initiated in the sign changes, except for Pluto and Aquarius, which is already permanent, but enfolding everything back in the cosmic womb of Pisces and Jupiter in Cancer, and going back and mixing it all together and then seeing what's born as it reappears next spring.
Mm.
Or next summer, no, summer of 2026.
Northern summer.
Yeah, northern summer, excuse me for being hemisphere centric, but northern summer, yes. So we'll see what emerges, but everything is being enfolded back in and taken, and so there's a huge amount of possibilities emerging, and then they'll be taken into the matrix of the cosmic matrix, and then brought out, I think, later.
And
Yeah.
so at Omega, just to touch on
Yeah.
some of our presentation, you will be speaking about the light and the dark feminine.
Yeah, I'll be speaking of the light and the dark feminine, yeah. Because I think it's really, we can also get extreme, we can, there are moments in culture where everything's bad about the masculine, and that's clearly not true, and everything's bad or wonderful, the feminine is idealized, and if only we return to a matriarchal
Yeah.
period. I've never, I don't adhere to by any ways, by any means, but it's almost, um less obvious in a way. There are a lot of dialogues where, because there's been a lot of hmm, imbalance, the dialogue tends to exaggerate. You know,
Exactly.
like the dialogue tends to take an extreme position. And we always know that those extreme positions are not true. But, you know,
And
I
yet
find,
we keep going to those extremes.
yeah, we keep going to those extremes because that's apparently what we need to do to learn or to change. Right? So, and, you know, if you think of the cultures where outwardly women, for example, don't have outward power to run their lives, to make decisions, whatever. There is power of a different kind that happens in other places that's developed. And you know, that's an outer example, but in an inner way, uh, and it's not like shadow energy disappears because we become conscious and work on it anyway. You know, it still crops up and is there. It's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, yeah, looking forward to that.
Mm, yeah, great.
And we're all going to speak about Jupiter in Cancer
Yeah.
because it has so many facets. You know, it's a big theme for the year, and since the conference kind of revolves around the Jupiter in Cancer theme, each of the speakers will have a kind of an initiation and share a different perspective on Jupiter in Cancer, and that's going to be part of the interactive dialogue with the audience, which you know it's exciting to me
Right.
to do that.
And
But
I,
then,
by
yeah,
the time we get together, um, you know, as I said, there are moments in the year where Jupiter's essentially the only water planet, which is a lot to carry. You know, a singleton in water is always complex. But by the time we get to our gathering at Omega, uh, we'll have Mars and Saturn will be in water signs again. And we'll be preparing Neptune's re-entry into
yeah,
Pisces, which happens later. So,
and going by the dual rulership of the North Node,
mm,
Jupiter rules the North Node in Pisces, and so as we have a North Node in water and the ruler in water, there's definitely a message, a cosmic celestial message about the need to integrate things. Water is about integration, it's about assimilation, it's about osmosis.
yeah,
And so, what I find that is difficult in the time that we are in, and everybody's being very confused right now as so many changes are happening, and I speak about US politics, and I speak about how that's changing the Ukraine and changing the Middle East and NATO. So one of the things I find that people struggle with is that it's not so much just the change, but the fact that we don't have time to integrate. It's happening very quickly. You know, the firing of people is from one day to the next. And so the water element seems to be bypassed. We're rushing into very definitive actions, or at least attempting to.
right. Well, we're trying to and seeing, but I think there. So you know what you're really underlining is that the fall is a period for emotional and psychological integration, and for a kind of, you know, we always think of water. Water's often used in ceremonies of purification. It's used for healing. It's used to take us. It's used for a sort of spiritual connectedness. And so all of those things come with the water period in the year. And I think everybody will really need that. And so I think it's a wonderful time for us to come together because there's that
Womb.
warmth, all right, that is really important, and also a connection to an ideal world. Like it's clear we're moving in a new time, and what from the old time is worth preserving.
Beautiful. And just a last note, the wake-up call. Uranus in Gemini. I like your subtitles. Um, you
Yes,
you were you were mentioned, you spoke last time about Jupiter in Gemini referring to learning a new language.
right.
And now Uranus in Gemini and the wake-up call.
Right. Well, I actually, I just cannot, I think having done some research on Uranus and Gemini, and I did a talk for Oprah at the end of the year. I wrote an article for their magazine. I think you're doing something really soon, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and there is this idea that Uranus and Gemini always brings a new way of learning, of connecting the dots, of understanding the world. It doesn't put us to sleep. It's
Yeah,
not a,
fascinating.
it's not a magic wand, it's not the sleepy wand. That is not Uranus and Gemini, and it's connected with so many things, like the Uranus that was in Gemini during the invention of the printing press. So you can, and the first library, and it goes on and on and on. How Uranus and Gemini opens up our ability to know things in a new way. Right. So I think it's very different than the let's march forward, the men will take care of things energy. It's very exciting, you know. And in some ways we can look at this transit of Jupiter and Gemini as preparing the ground, like coming in its kind of trickster way. Right.
Well, I mean, the wake-up call had a sound of an alarm.
Yes, there is also
So,
that. Yeah, there is also that.
mhm.
But I do think it's like kind of wake up, guys. You're like, you really believe everything you're being told, and it's a sort of a popping through
Yeah.
uh into another way of seeing things. But when you don't, there's the other element, the fact that the United States has always been at war with Uranus and Gemini,
Yeah.
that there's also this kind of, we have to do something. Right. So, but that, I didn't want to start with that because we're almost at the end. So I thought
Yeah,
I'd say
and
for the fall.
but I think that, if we go back to the United States being born with Uranus in Gemini, and then the Civil War, and then World War II, every time, even though there's conflict and war, that it's
Mm,
for a liberation. The
right.
intention in each of the birth of the United States was a statement of a liberation. And the Civil War, freed the slaves, and the United States entered World War II to kind of help dismantle and fight the Nazis. So even though there is definitely a let's do something, and the wake-up call may be related to that, but
Yeah, the wake up call can say there's real danger here and you have to take a stand, that it isn't all neutral. I mean, that is one of the things about Pisces, is one of the things we've heard. Well, what you believe and what I believe are basically equal, whatever, and that's made people crazy. Because people do need to make a choice, right? It's very hard to live in a world where everybody's point of view is equal, because it's not at a certain point. So we're in a period where we can't really afford to do that anymore. And it goes with the end of Pisces, but also Gemini has to do with the knowledge of the dark and the light,
Mhm.
the awareness that there's a left and a right hand. Yeah, it'll be very exciting. We'll see what happens. I'm really looking forward to it. And I love that we're talking about the feminine, because I think we're going to really, it's just going to be such a relief
Hmm.
after all this wonderful renewal of Aries energy, which, has a great side as well. I think that's what's really important, is we cannot get polarized on planetary placements because of our own biases. So, it's really important to see, well, what would be the best side of this? Whether there are astrological biases, as you said, about detriment and exaltation, or our political biases. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
You're welcome.
And safe
Thank you.
travels to Florida. And we look forward to recharging,
Mm-hmm.
reconnecting, and birthing also
Yeah.
something new together.